Israel and Hamas traded strikes across the border today on the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks. In addition to airstrikes, military activity and fighting on the ground could be seen inside the Gaza Strip. And this is footage of Israeli strikes on Beirut last night as Israel continues its offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Today, the Israeli Defense Forces issued an urgent evacuation order for 1/4 of Lebanon's coast. The order spans from the mouth of the Awali River down to the border between Israel and Lebanon. The IDF says it will operate in the maritime area and that disobeying the evacuation orders will be dangerous for residents. The warning comes as fears and anticipation over a wider regional war grow. Thomas Junot is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa and a Middle East policy analyst. Rhonda Sleem is a senior fellow and director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at the Middle East Institute. And John Allen is a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and a former Canadian ambassador to Israel. And they all join me now. It's good to see you all. Thank you for being here. Thomas, start with you if I could. We're a year into this, still no ceasefire deal on the table. At this point, are we closer to a ceasefire or closer to a much bigger military conflict in the region?
I think we're in between. We are certainly not close or closer to a ceasefire. I think what we've seen in the last days, weeks, and months shows that it's a tragedy to say that, but there's no reason to be optimistic in the short to midterm for a ceasefire. Positions have entrenched, have hardened on multiple sides. So there's simply no prospect. I would also add that we talk a lot about a ceasefire, but we tend to see a ceasefire as some kind of a mirage that we should aim for. But when a ceasefire happens, Gaza and South Lebanon will be completely destroyed. There will be no governance. There will be no infrastructure, no schools, no hospitals, no roads, and so on. Famine will be there, especially in Gaza. So a ceasefire in many ways will be a positive step, but it will be the beginning of a new chapter with a whole set of new problems that will come by. So yes, a ceasefire is something we should aim for, but it's not a solution in a deep sense. But the other side of your question, are we going to something worse? I think the scenario, and we can dig down deeper into that, of an all-out regional war is still less on the likely side. Violence has increased. Israel will retaliate, but I'm not sure that it will go to a full-out regional war.
Rhonda, how do you see it?
I tend to see that we are already in a regional war. You have now, number of fronts that are in the midst of confrontation. You have now Lebanon, before that Gaza. You also have the Yemenis, the Houthis in Yemen, with the Red Sea shipping being hampered and, not destroyed, but pretty much stopped. You have also in Syria and Iraq, pro-Iran militias that are aiming at U.S. assets and that are also sending, especially from Iraq at Israel, sending rockets and drones. So we are in a region. Are we at a tipping point to go into an all-out war, a scenario which everybody has been trying to prevent, including the United States? I tend to agree with Thomas. I think Israel will do a counterstrike, but I think depending on the counterstrike, Iran might react. And then we are maybe in a tit for tat for a couple of rounds, and then things might be contained.
So John, here we are still with this irreconcilable, or in my view, unsolvable demand that Bibi Netanyahu has, the eradication of Hamas and the release of hostages. One seems to make the other impossible in this situation. How do you get to the point where a ceasefire is a credible option if that is still the fundamental position right now?
Well, that's the crisis in Israel right now. Hostage families and 70% of the population wants the focus to be on the hostages, which requires a ceasefire negotiation. And Bibi Netanyahu and his two radical right ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, have been prioritizing the elimination of Hamas, which we all know in the end is not really possible. They have still not assassinated Sinwar, the leader of Hamas. I suggest that if they do get him, that might signal the beginning of the end, but I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly, unlike previous governments, which gave up 1,000 prisoners for one Israeli soldier, this government is not prioritizing the freeing of the hostages. It's prioritizing war.
So Tamar, does that mean that this cycle just continues? I interviewed the Israeli ambassador earlier, and he said, until the hostages are released and until Hamas gives up, we have to keep fighting in Gaza, is his position. And Mr. Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar, seems content to hide in the tunnels while everything is destroyed up above and not release anybody. And Bibi Netanyahu says he won't stop until they're gone and the people are back, and it doesn't seem solvable.
For now, no. I think, like I said in the earlier answer, I don't think it's reconcilable, at least for the short term. Positions are really entrenched, like you said. On the Hamas side, the leadership of Hamas is more than willing to see the destruction of Gaza in the pursuit of its own objectives, with little or no concern at all for civilian life above their heads in the Gaza Strip. The cycle continues, but it doesn't exactly repeat itself, in the sense that red lines are being pushed. Things that were considered not doable by Israel, by Hezbollah, just a few months or just a year ago, are now things that we see on a daily basis, whether it's assassinations of leaders by Israel and Hezbollah, targeting by Israel deeper inside Lebanon, or Hezbollah hitting Haifa in Israel just over the weekend. So yes, the cycle is repeating itself, but every time it seems that the minimum threshold of violence is just a bit higher, or the baseline of violence is just a bit higher than in the previous cycle. Right. And that makes it more difficult for civilians, something that we need to emphasize constantly, and it brings us farther away from a resolution.
Rhonda, what's your sense of, Hamas has been degraded militarily? Certainly it seems that way by any sort of military assessment, just looking at what's happened in Gaza. But politically, Bob Ray just said that he thinks that Gazans are done with Hamas. Is that true? Are they weakened? Are they eliminated as a political option? Or are they emboldened because of what has happened here?
I don't know if the orphans of the Palestinian orphans whose parents were killed by Israeli planes are blaming Hamas for their state, for their misery. I think they are blaming Israel. And that's a problem with this cycle of violence, is that it's generating a whole new generation of Palestinians, now Lebanese, other Arabs, who are moving away from where we were a year and a half ago. They are moving away from the normalization processes between Israel and its neighbor. They are moving away from, a regional security framework that includes Israel. I mean, what Israel does not realize is that you cannot bomb your way into people's hearts and people's minds. And that's what I'm afraid of. Like in Lebanon today, Hezbollah was really dealt by Israel in a near knockout blow, in the last 3 weeks. And then what do? They invade Lebanon. They give a new lifeline to Hezbollah. They give a new raison d'etre, a new mission to Hezbollah. Now, I don't think all the Lebanese support Hezbollah, far from it, but also all the Lebanese do not want their land to be occupied by Israel and to be and their sovereignty to be, invaded or disrespected. That's a problem today. As my colleagues here have said, only a political solution will get Israel what it needs, which is sustained long-term security. Military solutions are not going to get us there.
John, your thoughts on that before we take a break, just on whether this has in some ways, empowered Hamas and Hezbollah because of the civilian losses?
Well, there was a poll done by the Princeton School of International Affairs on it ran right up to October 6th, and Gazans at the time said they blamed equally Egypt, Israel, and Hamas for their situation. I don't think that, I think there are certain young people that are joining Hamas right now, but I don't think the majority of Gazans are very happy with Hamas right now, and I'm sure they would prefer another option. I do agree completely that Israel had an opportunity both in Gaza and in Lebanon to take some wins and then to try and deal with Hamas on the one hand and Hezbollah on the other in a way that would not alienate the populations there. The Americans told them to do that. The Americans told them they had made mistakes in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and they advised them not to go in and destroy. And I agree that Israel should have taken its wins, amazing wins vis-a-vis Hezbollah, which frankly were well deserved, and then tried to get their people back into their homes and move on with a set of negotiations, a beginning of a diplomatic move. But they seem intent rather on perhaps repeating past mistakes. They've had problems in Lebanon before, and if they're not careful, they're going to get into another quagmire because Hezbollah may have been decapitated at the top end, but there are plenty of well-trained fighters who are ready to put up a resistance.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break there, but when we come back, it's the one-year anniversary of the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th, and we're less than a month away from the U.S. election, a possible inflection point in this entire regional conflict in the Middle East. We're going to talk about that after this break. U.S. President Joe Biden held a candle-lighting ceremony at the White House today to commemorate the victims of the Hamas attack last year. In a statement earlier today, Biden condemned the attack and said he remained committed to Israel's right to defend itself. He also said the United States would not stop working to achieve a ceasefire deal in Gaza. We're going to talk about that with our panel, Tamaz Junot, Rhonda Sleem, and John Allen. Tamaz, I've read conflicting analysis on the U.S. and the role they've played in this, that they haven't been tough enough on Israel to cause a peace, but their public criticism of Israel has emboldened Hamas. And now we have the election coming next month. How do you assess where America fits into where things are right now and what comes next?
Well, the first thing to say is that the U.S. is the only external actor that really matters here, in the sense that we've seen, for example, a bit of a dispute between France and Israel in the past few days. I wouldn't say that that's irrelevant, but it's far secondary behind the U.S. In theory, the U.S. is the only actor that could really influence materially Israel's calculus. If you would want the U.S. to really pressure Israel towards a ceasefire, then the U.S. does have, in theory, levers like withholding military support, withholding intelligence, seriously withholding diplomatic support, and so on. But that's in theory. In practice, the U.S. has not done that, and realistically, it's not going to do that. Certainly not under Biden. And if we have a President Harris starting next year, what I see is that at most there would be tactical changes, but not a significant shift. So we should expect either continuity at that level, or in the case of a President Trump, then even more devoted American support for Israel in its war effort.
So, Rhonda, how do you see that, and how does that factor into, say, Benjamin Netanyahu's thinking, or how Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran are calculating it on the other side of this?
In the beginning of this conflict, I think President Biden was right in promising support and providing support to Israel. But and previous U.S. presidents in previous conflicts between, let's say, Hezbollah and Israel in 2006, before that, Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 to evict the PLO from Lebanon. Previous U.S. presidents have lent initially support to Israel and, in fact, gave time for Israel to achieve its military objectives. And then at some point, they decided, whether it's President Reagan in 1982 or President Bush in 2006, they decided that Israel was not about to achieve its military objectives. Israel has entered into a stalemate, and any further, in a way, continuation of the conflict or of the fighting would have hurt American interest in the region and would have hurt Israeli interest going forward. And I think we reached that point way back, maybe earlier this year, maybe since after November, when after the first deal that released some of the hostages and installed a temporary ceasefire on all fronts. By the way, there was a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, but also there was a ceasefire on the Lebanese-Israeli front. The Houthis stopped attacking, any kind of the ships in the Red Lane, every other. And I think at that point, starting with this year, there was an opportunity after the deal for President Biden to come in and apply leverage that previous US presidents, again, President Reagan, President Bush, applied to bring Israel to the negotiation table. I think what President Biden failed to understand is that continuation of the war, prolongation of the war, was itself part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's political calculus. And at this point, it was that kind of calculus that was dictating his decision and that was dictating Israeli policies. And I think that's where President Biden failed in not taking that into consideration. And then in the last 4 or 5 months, I think he was no longer able to apply this leverage because of the ongoing political campaign and political consideration for his own campaign before he stepped down inside the United States.
Right. John, how do you see it all?
Well, in terms of Gaza, I think Biden desperately wanted a ceasefire. There are American hostages there. He wanted a ceasefire because he wanted to win. But he was dealing with a prime minister who was far more concerned about his two right-wing ministers leaving the coalition than he was about pressure from Biden. And I think he calculated that ultimately Biden would not cut off offensive weapons and not really defensive weapons either. It certainly wouldn't cut off defensive weapons and wouldn't cut off offensive weapons. When the environment shifted to Hezbollah and to Iran, I think it became quite clear that if Biden had to choose between Israel or sworn enemies of the United States and Israel, that Biden wasn't going to be withdrawing weapons of any kind. So we're at that place right now. Bibi's got more or less free rein. Of course, there are other diplomatic measures that could be used, like at the UN Security Council, resolutions, etc. But that's not really pressure,
No.
as we heard from Ambassador Ray. That's not really pressure that's going to move Israel or Bibi Netanyahu right now. So I just don't think that the only actor that is capable of moving Israel is in a position to do so as we move towards November 5th. 70% of American Jews vote Democrat. Yes, there's a concern about Arabs in Michigan, which could be a crucial state. But I don't think we're going to see any major change in U.S. policy until after the election, and probably not then.
So, Tama, I've got 60 seconds, and then they're going to take the network. Trump, though, such a wild card in everything. If he wins, I mean, could he, what do you think could happen there? Because he's such an unpredictable guy, such a critic of Iran. What will you be watching for first, I guess, to keep it simple?
Very difficult to say. And as you said, unpredictability will be rule number one. On the one hand, Trump, you can expect him and his advisors to be very pro-Israel and very anti-Iran. But Trump has always had an instinct that has not been 100% of the time applicable, but he has always had an instinct that wanted to avoid military entanglement.
Right.
Right. So how he's going to weigh these different considerations is not clear, but I would lean on the side of very much pro-Israel.
Yeah, no, I think that is very clear. It's just how does that manifest itself, I guess, is the big question we're all waiting for. And as John has said many times on the show, it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is maybe counting on a Trump victory there to give him even a freer hand in how he's responding to this. So we'll have to see. I mean, it's like 28 days away. We're about 28 seconds away from the end of the show. I want to thank you all for being here yet again, because we've called on your expertise so many times. Tomas Junot, Ron Aslim, John Allen. We always appreciate it. Thanks for being here today.